We don't house your kind in the penthouse. Those were the first words that fell from the lips of Monica Hale, the general manager of the Regency Grand Hotel in Chicago. When she laid eyes on David Carter standing at the front desk, she didn't lower her voice. She didn't whisper. She projected it so that the guests sitting with cocktails in the lobby could hear. And in that moment, the atmosphere shifted from quiet luxury to something far colder. And that single sentence would set into motion a chain of events that would shake an entire staff, ruin careers, and reveal the hidden owner of the very building they worked in. Before we go on, drop your city in the comments, subscribe if stories of dignity and justice matter, and tap like if you believe respect comes before appearances. And now let's return to that night in Chicago, when a man who had once scrubbed hotel floors for minimum wage walked into the lobby of a hotel he secretly owned, only to be treated as though he was nothing. David Carter had built his company from the ground up. Carter Hospitality Group was valued at over $4.6 billion, operating 95 properties across 14 states. And just weeks earlier, he had finalized the $680 million acquisition of the Regency Grand chain. The flagship in Chicago was supposed to be a crown jewel. But David never trusted glossy brochures or staged reports. He trusted what his own eyes could see when no one knew his name. So he checked in under a corporate alias, dressed in worn jeans, a faded jacket, and sneakers that had scuffed soles, carrying a single weathered suitcase that looked more Greyhound station than private jet. And he walked deliberately across the marble lobby to test whether the people here lived the values they preached. Eric Johnson, a young front desk clerk, noticed him first. Eric hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, torn between greeting the man with courtesy or questioning why someone dressed like that would approach the check-in desk of a five-star hotel before he could speak. Monica appeared from the back office, heels clicking sharply, shoulders squared, the kind of presence that communicated authority without words. And with a single glance, she judged everything she thought she needed to know about David. She didn't ask for his name. She didn't look at the reservation system. She didn't even offer the polite script every hotel teaches. She simply folded her arms, tilted her head, and delivered the line that would echo for years. "We don't house your kind in the penthouse." Around them, a quiet ripple moved through the lobby. One man lowered his newspaper and smirked. A woman sipped her wine a little slower as she whispered to her friend, and another guest shook his head with an indulgent grin as if to say, "This man has clearly walked into the wrong place." David remained calm, his face unreadable, his voice even. He said he had a reservation under Carter Group. 3 nights in the penthouse suite. Monica's lips curled with a faint smile that wasn't kind. She replied that perhaps he was confused, that this establishment had standards, that he might feel more comfortable somewhere less particular. It was a dismissal wrapped in velvet, but a dismissal all the same. David quietly reached into his pocket and set down a card on the counter, the kind of card that few ever see and fewer still ever hold. A Centurion black card, metal, heavy, by invitation only. Monica barely looked at it. She gave a short laugh and said, "Anyone can buy a fake these days." Her tone was flat but cutting, and the weight of her dismissal spread across the room like a chill. Eric swallowed hard. He had never seen a Centurion before, yet his boss had brushed it aside as though it were a child's trick, and his hands trembled near the keyboard, but he didn't dare type. David's posture didn't change, his eyes calm but steady, as he said once more, "I would appreciate it if you would check your system." Monica refused. Instead, she pressed a small button under the counter, and 2 security guards appeared at the far end of the hall, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. They were large, practiced in presence, moving with quiet efficiency, and Monica simply nodded toward David as if issuing a routine order. One of the guards approached, his voice polite but firm, asking the man to step away from the desk. The other placed a hand lightly on David's shoulder, guiding him toward the exit. Still. David did not resist, did not raise his voice. He only looked Monica directly in the eyes and said softly, "I will remember every face I see tonight." That was the moment when the entire staff failed the test they did not even know they were taking. Guests pulled out their phones, screens glowing as they recorded discreetly. A woman whispered, "That's what happens when you try to fake your way into a place like this." Laughter followed, restrained but sharp, and Monica stood tall with satisfaction, believing she had defended the brand, defended the image of her hotel, when in reality she had just condemned herself, David Carter. The man they were escorting out as if he were an intruder was the new owner of the Regency Grand, the man who signed the checks that paid their salaries, the man who had once carried luggage up service stairwells and mopped bathrooms long before his name appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And the irony was not lost on him. He had built his empire by never forgetting what it felt like to be unseen. And tonight he had been given all the proof he needed that this hotel's culture was broken at its core. As he stepped through the glass doors into the sharp Chicago night air, the humiliation was real, but it wasn't personal. It was data, evidence, confirmation that beneath chandeliers and polished marble, arrogance had taken root. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and with a voice steady and controlled, he said, "Sarah, schedule a full board call in 20 minutes and send the press release." Then he added, "Make sure someone captures every face in that lobby." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his steps deliberate as he walked away into the dark. Inside, Monica received approving nods from a few guests, one even reaching out to shake her hand and tell her she had made a good call. But behind the desk, Eric finally allowed himself to type. He entered Carter Group, penthouse suite, 3 nights. The reservation appeared instantly. Corporate tier, CEO-level clearance. His throat tightened as he clicked deeper into the file, scrolling past the note that confirmed ownership, then quickly searching the name David Carter. In seconds, his screen filled with headlines, interviews, financial profiles. David Carter, founder and CEO of Carter Hospitality Group, acquires Regency Grand Hotels in $680 million deal. The picture showed the same man who had just been escorted out into the night, the same faded jacket, the same calm expression. Eric's breath caught as the truth sank in. He owns this place. He looked up from the screen, eyes wide, watching Monica bask in her false victory, unaware that in less than 20 minutes, everything she believed she controlled would be stripped away in front of staff, guests, and the world beyond those glass doors. David Carter stood outside the revolving doors of the Regency Grand, the city lights of Chicago flickering on the glass facade. And though the air was cold, his voice was calm as he ended the call with his assistant, knowing that within 20 minutes the same lobby that had laughed at him would be silent, and that silence would say more than any outburst ever could. Inside, Monica Hale carried herself like a queen who had defended her castle, receiving nods from guests who congratulated her on maintaining standards, while Eric Johnson sat frozen at the desk, staring at the reservation file still open on his monitor, the name Carter Group blinking like a warning he had ignored, and the realization hit him so hard he could barely breathe. Because the man they had just humiliated was not a vagrant or a scammer. He was the new owner of the entire chain, the man whose company had bought their paychecks, their uniforms, and even the marble under their feet. Eric wanted to speak, wanted to tell Monica the truth, but fear wrapped around his throat like a vice. He had seen colleagues fired for less than a whisper of defiance, and Monica's reputation for retaliation was legendary. So he sat still, heart pounding, watching her accept praise from wealthy guests who had no idea how close they were to the center of a storm. Down the hall, the security guards returned to their post, unaware that their polite but firm removal of David had already been recorded by half a dozen smartphones. Videos quietly uploading to social media platforms where captions were beginning to appear. Man with black card thrown out of Chicago's newest luxury hotel. Is this discrimination or protocol? Wait until you see what happens next. At first, the videos drew only scattered attention. But algorithms do not sleep. And by the time David was walking 3 blocks away to clear his head before returning, the first clip had already been shared over 1,000 times, the comments filling with outrage, speculation, and disbelief inside the lobby. Monica carried on with her routine, sipping sparkling water, instructing staff to keep watch for imposters who might try to sneak in, her tone smug, her posture rigid, convinced she had once again protected the image of the brand. She had survived past complaints by brushing them off as misunderstandings. She had silenced younger staff who dared to question her authority. And she truly believed this night would be another example of her control. But Eric couldn't ignore what he now knew. He leaned closer to the monitor, clicking deeper into David Carter's profile, reading about his rise from a bellhop in Detroit to the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, seeing photos of him in boardrooms, on stages, always calm, always measured. And Eric whispered to himself, "He owns this place," the words trembling as they left his lips. His colleague beside him raised an eyebrow, asking what he meant. But Eric shook his head quickly, covering the screen, terrified of what might happen if Monica saw what he had discovered too soon. He decided to wait, to hold the truth until the right moment. Because something inside him told him that David wasn't done, that men like that don't just walk away, they return. And when they do, the room changes. And return he did. Precisely 20 minutes later. The revolving doors turned once more, and the sound of footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Conversations faltered, glasses clinked too hard against saucers, and a hush swept through the lobby as every head turned. David Carter walked back into the same space where he had been humiliated, wearing the same faded jacket, the same scuffed shoes, the same calm expression. But this time there was something different. Not in him, but in the air, in the recognition flickering across faces as phones buzzed with breaking notifications, as whispers spread through the crowd. Is that him? Wait, isn't he the new owner? That's David Carter. The same guests who had laughed minutes earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some lowering their phones, others pretending not to notice, but everyone felt the weight of his presence. David did not glance at them. He did not acknowledge the stares. He walked with quiet precision straight to the front desk, and without a word, he placed a sleek black business card on the counter. Silver letters caught the light. David Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Carter Hospitality Group. The silence was deafening. Eric's breath caught as he looked down at the card, then back at the man in front of him. And in that moment, he knew the truth had arrived, not as rumor, but as fact. Monica's face hardened, her authority challenged in front of every guest, and she barked, "What is he doing back in here?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying a sliver of fear, but she quickly masked it with indignation, striding toward David with the same confidence she had displayed earlier. Yet David did not look at her, did not flinch, did not dignify her outrage with acknowledgement. Instead, he pulled out his phone once more, pressed a button, and placed it on the counter, the speaker already active. A crisp voice filled the lobby, echoing against the marble columns. "Mr. Carter, welcome to your new flagship property. The board is on the line, and we've been expecting your check-in." The effect was immediate and crushing. Guests gasped. One dropped a phone onto the floor. Another covered her mouth with both hands. Staff members exchanged wide-eyed glances, some instinctively stepping back as though distance could protect them from what was unfolding. Monica froze mid-step, her world collapsing with every syllable. She had denied the Centurion card, dismissed the reservation, humiliated the owner, and now the board itself had confirmed his authority in front of everyone. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came. Eric could see the panic in her eyes, the sudden realization that she had no defense, that the arrogance she had wrapped herself in was unraveling in real time. David remained calm, his silence more powerful than any outburst. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply allowed the truth to stand on its own. And in that truth, Monica was exposed. Then David finally spoke, his voice even, measured, but carrying the weight of judgment. "I didn't come here to make a scene. I came here to see the truth. And tonight, I saw it." The lobby was still, every guest and staff member hanging on each word. He turned to Eric, his gaze steady but not cold, and asked, "You still have my reservation on file?" Eric swallowed hard, nodding quickly, his voice trembling as he said, "Yes, sir. Penthouse suite. 3 nights. Confirmed." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling across the lobby, forcing every witness to confront the fact that the man they had dismissed as an imposter had been telling the truth all along. David gave a single nod, not in thanks, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of a system that had just failed its own test. Then he said, softly but clearly enough for all to hear, "I will be addressing this tonight, for everyone." In that instant, the power in the room shifted completely. Monica, who had stood so tall an hour earlier, now seemed small, her authority stripped bare. Guests who had chuckled now avoided her eyes. Staff who had obeyed her orders now questioned their loyalty. And Eric felt both dread and relief as he realized the reckoning was about to begin. David wasn't here to humiliate her in return. He was here to clean house, to reset the culture, to remind everyone that luxury without dignity is nothing more than polished stone and empty glass. And as cameras outside the hotel flashed and news alerts pinged across screens, the stage was set for what would become one of the most public reversals in hospitality history. A story of arrogance collapsing under the weight of truth, and a reminder that power means nothing until it is tested. The lobby of the Regency Grand was so still that even the sound of the air conditioning seemed loud, and David Carter allowed the silence to linger. Because silence had power. It forced people to confront themselves. It made every nervous cough and shifting footstep a confession. Then, without raising his voice, he said to the young clerk, "Pull the guest complaint records. Last 12 months. Filter by management actions." And Eric Johnson hesitated for only a second before his fingers began moving across the keyboard. The screen behind the desk flickering to life as line after line appeared. And the words formed a pattern that needed no interpretation. Because there it was in black and white. 17 entries. Every one of them tied to one name, Monica Hale. 17 complaints of mistreatment, discrimination, and humiliation. Some from guests, some from staff, some settled quietly, others ignored, but all now displayed in front of employees, guests, and the CEO who had just been mocked as an imposter. David didn't look at Monica when he said, 17 complaints in 1 year. He let the number hang in the air like a gavel striking wood, and the ripple it created was immediate. Heads turning, eyes narrowing, whispers building. Monica stepped forward, her voice sharp but cracking at the edges. "Those are exaggerated, misunderstandings. You can't take them at face value." But before she could say more, David raised his hand slightly, and his calm cut sharper than her protests. "And the 6 payouts," he added, his eyes never leaving the screen. And Eric clicked again, pulling up sealed settlements, 6 discrete payments, 6 moments when money had been used to bury the truth, dates listed, amounts redacted, but the existence undeniable. And a low gasp ran through the lobby. Monica froze, her face flushing red, her words faltering. That's standard practice in this industry. It's about protecting the brand." And David turned to her then, his gaze steady, his tone even. "You're not protecting the brand. You're calling discrimination a policy." The words cut through the marble air like glass breaking, and in that moment Monica's power cracked, because her defense was the very evidence of her guilt. From the side of the lobby, a woman in a housekeeping uniform stepped forward hesitantly, wringing her gloved hands, her voice almost a whisper but steady. "She yelled at me once. No reason. Just because I was in her line of sight." And the room shifted again. Monica opened her mouth to retaliate, but David raised his hand once more. Not to silence her, but to invite others. And he turned slightly toward the security camera above the desk, speaking not just to those present, but to anyone who might watch later. "If you have experienced the same, you are not alone. You are not invisible. Now is the time to speak." For a moment there was hesitation. Then one hand lifted, then another. A concierge, a valet, a server. And one by one acknowledgments spread across the room. Quiet, but undeniable. The silence Monica had relied on for years crumbling, as the very people she believed would stay mute forever finally found their voices. Near the fireplace, an older guest, a woman with pearls at her neck, stepped forward with poise but fire in her eyes. "Last spring I had a confirmed suite here. I was told the morning of that it had been reassigned for maintenance, but I know why. I didn't look like the other guests." And Eric, now emboldened, typed quickly, his voice shaking as he read the record. "Reservation reassigned. No maintenance logged. No alternate reason noted." The murmur that followed was no longer restrained. It was outrage, disbelief, vindication, and Monica's composure began to crumble. Her voice snapped sharp. "I was protecting the image. Our standards matter. We can't just—" But David cut her off, not with volume but with precision. "Luxury is not marble and chandeliers. It is dignity. And if your standard strips people of theirs, then your standard is broken." The line landed like a verdict, and the weight of it pressed into every corner of the lobby. He stepped closer now, not to intimidate but to be heard, his voice lowering slightly, intimate but firm. "I used to mop floors in the first hotel I ever built. I carried luggage up stairwells. I scrubbed bathrooms. I know this industry from the ground up because I started at the ground. And no one, no manager, no guest, no policy, gets to decide a person's worth by the shoes on their feet or the jacket on their back." The lobby held its breath, because it wasn't just a rebuke, it was a confession, and in that confession was authority no title could manufacture. Guests shifted in their seats, ashamed of their laughter from earlier. Staff members who had been silent now felt a stir of pride that maybe things could change. And Monica stood trapped in the glare of truth, her defenses collapsing, her authority gone, her legacy shattering not by scandal whispered in back offices, but by evidence displayed in front of everyone. And as if on cue, the buzz of phones intensified, push notifications lighting screens. Breaking, CEO David Carter confronts Regency Grand Management. Tweets climbing, hashtags trending, video clips already merging, one showing him escorted out, another showing him standing tall at the desk with his business card. And the contrast was devastating. The room that had mocked him 20 minutes earlier now watched history unfold in real time. A public reckoning that could not be spun, could not be buried, could not be undone. David let the moment breathe. Then he turned once more to Eric. "Show me the names of every staff member connected to these complaints." And Eric, though his hands shook, obeyed, the screen filling with timestamps, initials, and actions. And though some were minor, others glaring, one truth became clear. Monica Hale's reign of fear and arrogance had touched nearly everyone in that building. David did not raise his voice. He did not point. He did not humiliate. He simply let the record speak. And in that record, Monica was finished. The crowd no longer looked at her with respect or fear. They looked at her with disdain, with relief that perhaps her time had ended. And Monica's eyes darted frantically, searching for allies, but found none. Not even in the guards who had once obeyed her orders. Not in the guests who had once praised her firmness. She was alone. And the weight of that loneliness crushed her shoulders until her posture slumped and her lips pressed thin. David's phone still rested on the counter, the board listening. The HR director connected, press outlets already broadcasting. And he finally said, "This is not about one night. This is about a culture. And tonight that culture changes." His words were simple, but they carried the authority of a man who had lived every rung of the ladder, from mop to marble, from servant to CEO. And no one doubted that change was no longer optional. It was already here. The moment the screen behind the desk froze on Monica Hale's name, tied to 17 complaints and 6 settlements, the lobby seemed to draw in its own breath and wait. Every pair of eyes locked on David Carter, and he let that weight hang for several seconds, his silence sharper than any accusation. Then, in a voice that carried both calm and authority, he said, "Jennifer, patch HR into this line. I want termination files ready, immediate execution." And from his phone on the counter, the clear, professional voice of Jennifer Ross, head of human resources for Carter Hospitality Group, filled the marble room. "Understood, Mr. Carter. Connecting now." Guests shifted in their seats, some fumbling with their phones to capture what was happening, others staring in disbelief that such a corporate reckoning was unfolding in front of their glasses of wine. And Monica, still standing frozen with her arms folded tight against her chest, found her voice enough to spit out, "This is a setup. You planned this." But her words sounded thin, desperate, swallowed by the evidence still glowing on the screen. David did not look at her when he replied. He kept his eyes on the staff, on the people who had endured her arrogance for years. "No, Monica, this isn't a setup. This is accountability, and accountability does not wait for your permission." Her face paled, and she turned toward the staff as though seeking loyalty. But none came. Eric kept his eyes on the monitor. The concierge stared at the floor. Even the security guards who had escorted David out earlier now stood still, offering her no shield. Into the tense air, the HR director's voice returned, crisp and final. "Termination file for Monica Hale prepared. Authorization required." David pressed his fingertip to the phone, biometric confirmation flashing across the screen, and Jennifer's voice echoed once more. "Termination executed, access revoked, documentation distributed to legal and staff channels." At the front desk, Eric's screen refreshed, Monica's profile blinking once before the words "access removed" appeared in red, her name disappearing in real time, and the soft electronic ping that confirmed the action was louder than any applause, louder than any protest. It was the sound of a door closing forever. The gasp that followed was collective, half disbelief, half catharsis, and Monica's eyes darted wildly, searching for some lever of control she could still pull, but there were none left. She lunged toward the desk, her voice shrill now. "You can't do this! I've given 20 years to this brand. I've protected its image. But David finally turned to face her fully, and with a quiet firmness that cut through her tirade, he said, "You protected yourself, not the brand. You silenced people to preserve your power, and now you will answer for it." The security guards stepped closer, no longer under her command, but under the authority of the owner standing before them. And their presence was not aggressive. It was final, a reminder that her reign was over. One gently gestured toward the exit. and for the first time all evening Monica stumbled. Not from force, but from the collapse of the pedestal she had built beneath her feet. Guests who had once applauded her firmness now pulled back, eyes avoiding hers. The same silence she had relied on to intimidate now turned against her. A silence of abandonment, of rejection. She tried once more to protest. "This will ruin me. You don't understand." But David's reply was surgical. "No, Monica, you ruined yourself. All I did was make it visible." Her lips trembled. Her eyes glistened. But there was no sympathy in the room. Only the weight of years of quiet harm finally exposed. The guards escorted her slowly toward the revolving doors, cameras flashing from outside as the press had already gathered, their red lights blinking like a jury's gaze. And when the doors closed behind her, the room exhaled as if released from a long-held breath. David did not let the moment linger too long, because this was not about spectacle. It was about change. And he turned back to the staff, his voice steady. Tonight was not about one manager. Tonight was about a culture that allowed arrogance to replace service, that let fear silence truth. That ends now. His words rolled through the lobby with the cadence of a promise rather than a speech, and staff members straightened unconsciously, some with hope, some with shame, but all knowing they were witnessing not just the end of Monica's authority, but the beginning of something new. He gestured toward Eric, who was still trembling at the desk, and said, "You hesitated tonight, but hesitation is human. What matters is what you do next, and you did what was right. You showed the truth." Eric's chest tightened, uncertain whether it was a rebuke or an honor. But when David's eyes held his for a moment, he understood it was a door being opened, not a punishment being delivered. Guests shifted again, sensing the balance of the evening tipping toward resolution rather than chaos. But outside, camera flashes reminded them all that the world was now watching, that what had begun as a private humiliation was already a public story. David leaned slightly closer to the phone, still on speaker, and said, "Jennifer, notify all staff that internal complaint records will be made public effective immediately. No more hidden files, no more sealed settlements. If we demand transparency from guests, we will live by it ourselves," the HR director confirmed. "Yes, Mr. Carter, implementing now." And Eric's screen blinked again as a message cascaded across the system. "All complaint records now visible to staff channels." A murmur ran through the room, equal parts shock and relief, because the walls of silence that had long shielded misconduct were crumbling, and the message was clear. The new owner valued dignity over secrecy. Monica's absence was a void, but it was a liberating one. And as David stood in that void, he did not gloat. He did not bask in victory. He simply let the truth settle into the marble and glass around them, knowing that leadership was not about declarations, but about the culture you enforce when no one is looking. The guests who had mocked him earlier now avoided his gaze, ashamed, some already composing apologies in their minds, others silently grateful they had been spared exposure themselves. The staff, meanwhile, felt the first stirrings of courage they had not allowed themselves for years, because fear had ruled them. But fear had been removed with a single ping on a computer screen. David closed the moment with words simple but unforgettable. "This hotel is not marble. It is people. And tonight those people will no longer be silenced." And with that, Part 4 of the reckoning was sealed. A night when a general manager lost her career not behind closed doors, but in the open air of truth, under chandeliers and cameras alike. And the man who had once been escorted out as an intruder now stood as the undeniable owner, not just of a building, but of the future it would represent. The lobby of the Regency Grand was still humming with the echo of what had just happened. Monica Hale's name deleted from the system, her presence erased, and yet the weight of years of her arrogance still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. But David Carter knew he could not leave the space smoldering. He had to rebuild it in that very moment. And so he stepped forward, resting one hand lightly on the counter, his voice calm but firm. Effective immediately. This property will operate under a policy of full transparency. No hidden rules, no backdoor settlements. Every staff member will know their rights. Every guest will know their worth. The words fell steady and deliberate, and the staff listened, some with hope in their eyes, others with nervousness, because change that swift is unsettling. But they all understood they were hearing the beginning of a new culture. David turned slightly so that his voice carried not just to the employees clustered near the desk, but also to the guests in velvet chairs and marble alcoves. Luxury is not about shutting doors on people, it is about opening them. And if you cannot serve with dignity, you cannot serve under this brand. His phone still rested on the counter, and through its speaker, the voice of Jennifer Ross, head of HR, confirmed. System-wide memo drafted. Mr. Carter, roll out in 30 minutes. That simple sentence was more powerful than applause. It was machinery moving, bureaucracy turning, proof that what was being declared was not symbolic but operational. And in the lobby, several employees exchanged glances of relief, finally seeing an end to the culture of intimidation outside. However, the flashbulbs of cameras painted the glass doors in staccato light, the press having swarmed after catching wind of the earlier incident, and in minutes the story had leapt from whispered rumor to breaking news. Social feeds pulsed with side-by-side clips, one showing David escorted out, another showing him calmly dismissing Monica, and the narrative was undeniable. Arrogance versus truth, dismissal versus dignity. As reporters pressed their faces and microphones against the glass, security struggled to contain the crowd, but David lifted a hand, signaling to let them in. And when the doors finally opened, the lobby became a stage, tripods unfolding, boom mics extending, red recording lights blinking like a constellation. This was no longer an internal reckoning. It was public testimony, and David embraced it. He stood in the center of the marble floor without podium or script, his faded jacket still on his shoulders. And when the first question came, "Mr. Carter, why didn't you reveal who you were from the start?" He answered without hesitation. "Because I don't need anyone bowing when I walk in. I need them to serve with integrity when they think no one's watching." The line hit like a thunderclap, traveling through the microphones, across networks, onto screens in living rooms and phones across the country, and within seconds it was trending. Quoted, repeated, amplified. A single sentence that spoke to more than hotels. It spoke to leadership itself. Guests who had earlier smirked now sat stiff, realizing they had become background characters in a story that would play endlessly on national news. And staff members who had once been invisible now felt the weight of validation, that the silent struggles of years were finally being acknowledged out loud. David continued, laying out reforms in the same calm tone. All staff will undergo dignity and equity training within the next 90 days. Not a seminar, not a box to check, but a program we will design with outside experts, and every manager will be reviewed not just on revenue but on respect. Complaint systems will be anonymous. Retaliation will be grounds for immediate termination, and I will personally review quarterly reports. His words were not lofty promises but practical steps, and that practicality gave them power. Employees nodded, some with tears they did not hide, because promises had been made before but never with this kind of public accountability outside. CNN and local Chicago outlets began broadcasting live, anchors cutting into primetime shows with breaking news. Billionaire CEO humiliated, then takes over his own hotel, and the split-screen coverage showed David in real time, his jacket ordinary, his tone steady, contrasted with earlier clips of Monica sneering, the guards escorting him, and guests laughing, The contrast was devastating, and across living rooms in America, viewers saw not just a story of corporate ownership, but a story of prejudice confronted and reversed. Inside. David pressed forward, not letting the cameras dictate the rhythm, but speaking as if he were in a closed meeting. This is bigger than one hotel. This is about how we treat people everywhere, in every lobby, in every interaction. Luxury without respect is not luxury. It's theater. And tonight the show is over. A murmur of agreement moved through the lobby, one guest even clapping before realizing the gravity of the moment. But the ripple was there, a shift in the energy, a recognition that a truth too often buried had been spoken under chandeliers and broadcast to the world. David turned then to Eric, who had been standing behind the desk, pale and trembling but resolute, and addressed him directly. You had the chance to stay silent, and you nearly did. But then you showed the truth, and that hesitation mattered, because it means you know the difference, and that difference will serve you well. Eric swallowed hard, overwhelmed that the CEO would address him in front of cameras, unsure whether it was rebuke or recognition. But when David added, "You may do better than the last one," it was clear that this was possibility, not condemnation. A door cracked open for someone who had once feared speaking up. The cameras captured the exchange, the juxtaposition of a young clerk shaken by the night's events and a CEO who had once been a bellhop himself. And that image spread online within minutes. A reminder that leadership is often about recognizing the hesitant courage of others. Monica's absence was felt like a shadow just outside the doors, though she had been escorted into the night. Her legacy of intimidation still lingered, and reporters outside were already digging into her past, discovering prior complaints, political connections, and settlements buried in paperwork, and within hours, headlines would confirm her downfall was not just local, but national. A career ruined by arrogance now exposed. But inside the lobby, David made sure the story was not about her downfall, but about the rise of something else. And he closed his statement with words chosen for permanence. We will rebuild this place from the ground up, not with fear, but with decency. Respect will not be optional. It will be the standard, and those who cannot meet that standard will not serve under my name. The lobby erupted, not with cheers, but with the kind of stillness that carries respect, because the guests and staff understood they were part of a turning point, not just a spectacle. Outside, hashtags climbed, hashtag Chicago Hotel Truth, hashtag Dignity First, and clips of David speaking spread across social media, drawing millions of views before dawn. Inside, the staff straightened their uniforms, standing taller, knowing eyes of the world were on them now. And in that single night, what began as humiliation transformed into a movement, a reminder that power means nothing until tested, and respect means everything when it is given freely. In the weeks that followed, the echoes of that night in Chicago grew louder, spreading from the marble floors of the Regency Grand to boardrooms, courtrooms, and newsrooms across the country. Monica Hale's termination had been swift, but her consequences were only beginning, because within days the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission announced an investigation into her history of complaints, and local journalists unearthed a trail of settlements and favoritism that stretched back over a decade, painting a portrait of a manager who had hidden behind standards while systematically excluding, belittling, and retaliating against those who didn't fit her narrow view of luxury. And as more victims came forward, a class action lawsuit formed, naming Monica personally alongside the hotel she once commanded, stripping her of the political connections she had leaned on for years, and leaving her career in tatters. She went from commanding staff under chandeliers to sitting across from federal investigators, her voice trembling as she tried to explain why so many stories sounded the same, why so many faces carried the same scars. and the cameras that once recorded her confidence now captured her collapse. Meanwhile, David Carter's decision to make complaint records public had a ripple effect that stunned the industry. Other hotels watched as transparency transformed staff morale at the Regency Grand, with employees suddenly more willing to raise concerns, not in fear of retaliation, but with the assurance that their voices mattered. And within 3 months, Carter Hospitality Group saw a drop in staff turnover by nearly 30%, and surveys revealed a sharp rise in guest satisfaction, not because the marble was shinier or the wine list longer, but because guests sensed a shift in culture, a warmth that could not be manufactured, a respect that could not be faked. David himself became a reluctant symbol. Featured on news panels and magazine covers, his words quoted endlessly, "Luxury without respect is theater, and the show is over." A line that resonated far beyond hotels, echoing in corporate boardrooms and workplaces where dignity had long been sacrificed for image. At the Regency Grand itself, the transformation was visible. Where once staff had kept their heads down, now they looked guests in the eye. Where once whispers carried resentment, now laughter returned to back hallways, and the fear that had governed them for years evaporated with every week that Monica's name appeared in headlines about investigations and lawsuits. Eric Johnson, the clerk who had hesitated and then revealed the truth, grew into his role with newfound confidence, taking on tasks beyond his station, mentoring newer employees, and earning respect for his honesty. Within 6 months, David quietly approved his promotion to assistant manager, a decision met with applause from staff who remembered the night he had stood trembling yet truthful in front of the world. Guests, too, remembered. Reviews poured in online, praising not only the comfort of suites and the polish of service, but the authenticity of the staff. Stories of concierges listening with care, of housekeepers treated with dignity, of managers who finally asked not only what guests needed, but how employees were treated behind the scenes. And those stories became the real marketing campaign. The reason bookings surged even amid negative headlines about Monica's downfall. For Monica, the reversal was brutal. Where once she walked through lobbies with pride, now she walked into courtrooms with shame. Her lawyer struggling to defend against evidence of discrimination that had been documented in system records now made public. And the same silence she once enforced from staff now came from her so-called allies. Politicians who once praised her efficiency quietly distancing themselves. Colleagues refusing to answer her calls, and neighbors watching with thinly veiled judgment as news vans parked outside her suburban home. For David, however, there was no celebration, no victory lap. He continued visiting hotels undercover, still testing cultures, still reminding himself that leadership was about what happened when no one was looking. And though cameras followed him more closely now, he kept his tone measured, repeating to anyone who asked that he was not interested in fame. He was interested in fairness. And as spring turned into summer, the plaque at the entrance of the Regency Grand told the story more powerfully than any interview. Simple words engraved in bronze. Luxury means respect. Always. Guests paused to read it. Employees straightened when they passed it, and visitors carried it in their memories long after checkout, because in a world saturated with apologies and empty slogans, here was a place that had lived through humiliation and come out with truth. Monica's name faded from headlines as new scandals filled the cycle, but her story remained a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when arrogance is mistaken for leadership. And David's reforms stood as the antidote, a blueprint for how an empire could be built not on fear, but on dignity, not on silence, but on voice. 7 months after that unforgettable night, the Regency Grand Chicago no longer felt like the same building where arrogance had once ruled under chandeliers. The marble floor still shone. The chandeliers still glittered. The penthouse still commanded its $2,000 a night. But the heartbeat of the place had changed, and it showed in ways big and small, in the way staff smiled without fear, in the way guests were greeted without judgment, and in the way a culture once smothered by intimidation had been reborn through transparency and trust. And on this crisp evening, David Carter returned not undercover, not in worn jeans and scuffed sneakers, but in the role he had never sought, but now accepted fully. The role of a leader who had turned humiliation into reform. And as he walked through the glass doors, a murmur spread, not of suspicion this time, but of recognition, of respect, earned not demanded. At the front desk stood Eric Johnson, posture straighter, tie perfectly in place, no longer trembling behind a keyboard, but standing tall as the new general manager. A title David had quietly approved 2 months earlier after Eric completed his training program with diligence and humility. And tonight Eric would stand before staff and guests to mark a new chapter. David paused a moment in the lobby, remembering the sting of that night when Monica Hale had declared, "We don't house your kind in the penthouse," remembering the laughter, the cameras, the humiliation that had been entertainment to strangers. And yet he also remembered how silence had broken, how staff had found courage, how truth had replaced fear, and he knew this moment was not about him, but about them. The crowd gathered, employees in uniforms freshly pressed, guests lingering with curiosity, local press once again present, but this time not to capture scandal, but to witness legacy. And Eric stepped forward to speak, his voice clear though his hands trembled slightly with emotion. 7 months ago, I froze. I nearly stayed silent when it mattered, but because of what happened that night, I learned silence protects no one. Tonight I want to say thank you, not only to Mr. Carter for believing in me, but to every staff member who chose courage over fear, and to every guest who reminded us that hospitality is not about marble or chandeliers, it is about people. Applause rose, genuine and unforced, and David nodded quietly, pride not in his own actions but in the man who had grown before his eyes. A reminder that leadership is not inherited or purchased. It is chosen in moments of fear and truth. As cameras flashed, David stepped forward finally, his voice low but carrying. I want you to know, I never came here to fire anyone. I came here to see who deserved to stay. And tonight I can tell you, those who chose respect, those who chose dignity, those who chose to stand for what is right, you are the future of this company, and you will carry it forward. The staff stood taller, some with tears, some with pride. And in that instant, the lobby became more than a hotel entrance. It became a stage where history and hope met. Outside, the news vans broadcast the ceremony live, captions scrolling. From humiliation to reform, Carter Hospitality celebrates new era. And viewers across the country saw something rare. Not a scandal, but a resolution. Not an empty apology, but a lasting change. In the weeks to come, the Carter model, public complaint records, dignity training, accountability for managers, spread across the industry, as competitors scrambled to adopt similar measures, fearing not only lawsuits but the loss of reputation in a world where every guest carried a camera and every employee had a voice. And David's quiet philosophy. Luxury means respect, always, became not only a plaque on a wall, but a mantra for an industry forced to confront itself. For Monica Hale. The consequences had continued. The lawsuit against her and the hotel was settled for millions. Her professional licenses revoked, her political connections severed, and though her name faded from headlines, it lived on as a cautionary tale in training manuals and HR seminars. The story of how arrogance disguised as standards could destroy a career. For Eric, however, life had changed in the opposite direction. His parents watched proudly as his name appeared in local papers. Colleagues who once dismissed him now looked to him for guidance. and he embraced his role not with ego, but with humility, remembering always the night when his hesitation nearly cost him, and how a single act of truth had saved his path. For David. The journey was full circle. He stood that evening near the bronze plaque at the entrance, running his hand over the words. Luxury means respect. Always. And he thought of his first job mopping floors, of the countless times he had been dismissed for looking like he didn't belong. And he realized that night in Chicago had never been about firing one woman. It had been about proving that no one could decide another person's worth by their shoes or their jacket. And that message, spoken in marble and glass, would outlast him. He bowed his head slightly as staff gathered around him, not out of deference but out of shared purpose. And he ended the evening with words that would live on beyond the cameras. Power means nothing until it is tested. Respect means everything when it is given freely. And if this hotel stands for anything, let it stand for that. The applause that followed was not thunderous, but steady, the kind of applause that carries gratitude. And as the lights dimmed and the guests returned to their rooms, the Regency Grand Chicago was no longer a symbol of exclusion, but of transformation. A place where a man once humiliated in silence had turned shame into justice, where staff once silenced by fear had found their voices, and where a culture once broken had been rebuilt, one truth at a time, until marble and chandeliers were no longer the story, but dignity was. Thank you so much for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world.